By the time the email came in, Daniela had already decided to ignore it. She was seated at her small dining table, laptop open, coffee gone cold beside her, spreadsheets glowing back at her like a mirror of the life she had built. Stable, respectable, predictable. The kind of life people prayed for and then thanked God for once they had it. The subject line blinked softly at the top of her inbox. Community Outreach Lead, Church Plant Initiative. She exhaled slowly and closed the tab. Daniela had learned over the years how to recognize disruptions disguised as opportunities. They always came with a sense of unrest, an inexplicable tug in her chest, a quiet disturbance that refused to settle, and she had promised herself she was done responding to those. She had responsibilities now, a career, rent that depended on consistency, a reputation built on being reliable, not reckless. God understood that, right? The calling hadn't arrived suddenly. It never did. It had been layered. First, it was the restlessness she felt every Sunday after service. When worship ended, people filed out, and she remained seated longer than necessary, staring at the stage as if something unfinished lingered in the air. Then it was the conversations, strangers, co-workers, even Uber drivers opening up to her unprovoked, sharing their fears, their doubts, their quiet hunger for meaning. You explain things in a way that makes God feel close, someone once told her. Daniela laughed it off. I'm not called, she told herself. I'm just kind. That night, she lay in bed, scrolling aimlessly, avoiding the email she pretended no longer existed. Her phone buzzed, a message from her mother. I was praying tonight and felt led to ask, are you running from something God asked you to do? Daniela sat upright. Her heart began to race, not from fear, but from recognition. God had always spoken to her like this, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. She prayed that night the way tired people pray, without poetry, without structure. Lord, if this is you, I need you to be clear. I don't want to confuse my feelings with your voice. The room stayed quiet, but peace didn't come. Instead, clarity did, and clarity, she was learning, often came with a cost. The next morning, she opened the email. The role wasn't glamorous, no salary increase, no guarantee of success, just a vision, building faith-based support spaces for young adults navigating purpose, doubt, and identity. It sounded exactly like the conversations God kept placing in her path. Daniela closed her eyes. This will change everything, she thought, and for the first time, she realized that was the point. God's callings, she was discovering, didn't always pull you out of comfort. Sometimes they asked you to lay it down willingly. Daniela didn't tell anyone she had opened the email, not at first. She went to work as usual, sat through meetings, nodded at conversations that felt suddenly distant, like she was observing her own life from across the room. Everything looked the same, but something underneath had shifted. When God calls, He doesn't always rearrange your surroundings immediately. Sometimes He rearranges your attention, and once that happens, nothing feels neutral anymore. That evening, Daniela met her friend Naomi for dinner. They had been friends since university, bonded by late-night prayers, shared journals, and the kind of faith that once burned hot and fearless. Naomi was thriving now, promotions, engagement plans, a life unfolding exactly as expected. So, Naomi said, smiling as she stirred her drink, how's work? Still saving the world one spreadsheet at a time? Daniela smiled back, hesitated. She almost said nothing, but something in her chest tightened, the same quiet pressure that had been following her all week. I might be changing direction, Daniela said slowly. Naomi's eyes lit up. Changing how? Daniela swallowed. I think God is asking me to step into ministry. The word hung between them. Naomi blinked, then laughed softly, not mockingly, but with surprise. Like, full-time? I don't know yet. Naomi leaned back in her chair. That's big. It wasn't disapproval, but it wasn't encouragement either, and Daniela realized something painful in that moment. God's callings often sound unreasonable to people who love you. That night, the doubts came in waves. You're being emotional. You'll disappoint people. You'll lose stability. You'll regret this. Daniela knelt beside her bed, hands clasped so tightly her fingers ached. Lord, she whispered, why does obedience feel like grief? No thunder, no angelic reassurance, just a memory. She remembered being 17, sitting alone in the back of church, scribbling in a notebook while the pastor spoke about purpose. "Some of you will be called to places that don't clap for you," he had said, "but heaven will recognize you." She hadn't understood it then. She did now. The following weeks were not filled with excitement. They were filled with resistance. Emails were unanswered, meetings were postponed, support felt thin. And the strangest part, nothing went wrong outwardly, but everything felt heavy inwardly. This was Daniela's first lesson in spiritual warfare. The enemy doesn't always block God's call. Sometimes he simply tries to exhaust you before you obey. One Sunday after service, Daniela stayed behind again. This time, the pastor approached her. "I don't usually say this, but I feel led to ask, are you discerning a call?" Daniela's eyes filled instantly. She nodded. "I'm scared," she admitted. He smiled kindly. "That's usually how you know it's real." That night, Daniela finally said the words out loud in prayer. Yes. Not confidently, not dramatically, just honestly. And something lifted. Not her circumstances, not her questions, but the weight of resisting. Daniela thought saying yes would bring clarity. Instead, it brought exposure. Not public exposure, internal, the kind that makes you see what you've been leaning on besides God, the kind that quietly removes familiar supports and asks, "Now what?" Within a month of her decision, the shifts began, small at first. Her supervisor announced restructuring. Her role was no longer essential. The promotion she had been quietly considered for was paused indefinitely. "Well, things change," her supervisor said kindly. Daniela nodded. She didn't tell him that things had already changed. She started volunteering evenings with the outreach team, planning gatherings, listening to young adults pour out stories of burnout, confusion, spiritual fatigue. It was holy work and exhausting. She would come home late, emotionally full, but physically drained, collapsing on her couch with her Bible unopened beside her. "God," she whispered one night, "I thought calling would feel more clear than this." What she didn't yet understand was this: calling often feels clearest in hindsight, not in the moment. The resistance wasn't just circumstantial, it was relational. Naomi stopped asking questions. Friends grew awkward when she talked about ministry. Family members offered practical advice, thinly veiled as concern. "You're so smart," her aunt said over the phone. "It just feels like a waste." Daniela smiled politely and said nothing. But after the call ended, she sat in silence, the word waste echoing painfully. She opened her Bible randomly, desperate, tired. Her eyes landed on a verse she had read dozens of times before. "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it produces much grain." She closed the Bible. "I don't want to disappear," she whispered. "I just want to obey." The hardest part wasn't losing approval, it was losing certainty. Her savings thinned, her schedule grew unpredictable, her prayers became shorter, rawer, less "Lord, show me," more "Lord, stay with me." And God did, not by fixing things, but by meeting her. One evening, after a particularly draining session, Daniela lingered alone in the church hall. Chairs stacked, lights dimmed, silence heavy. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, and cried. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind that comes when you're too tired to perform faith. "I didn't know it would feel like this," she said softly. "I didn't know I would feel so small." And for the first time since this journey began, Daniela felt God answer, not with words, but with presence so tangible it startled her. Not condemning, not disappointed, just near. And in that stillness, something settled in her spirit. God was not asking her to be impressive, he was asking her to be available. Weeks later, something unexpected happened. One of the young women from the outreach team, Leah, asked Daniela to talk. They sat in a quiet cafe, steam rising between them. "I almost didn't come to that program," Leah admitted. "I felt like I didn't belong." Daniela smiled faintly. "Me too." Leah's eyes filled. "The way you spoke that night, about not having all the answers, but choosing to trust God anyway, it changed something for me." Daniela blinked. You don't know this, but I had decided to give up on church. I thought faith was only for people with perfect stories. She paused. You made room for me. Daniela walked home that night in silence, heart pounding, not with pride, but with awe. This was fruit, quiet, uncelebrated, real. Calling, she was learning, does not announce itself with applause. It whiskers through changed lives. Daniela didn't plan to almost quit. It crept in quietly, like most dangerous thoughts do. It started with exhaustion, not the kind sleep fixes, the kind that settles into your bones and whispers, enough. Her mornings became heavier. Her prayers felt dry. Her Bible stayed open longer without being read. And then came the question she hadn't allowed herself to ask before. What if I misunderstood God? The outreach program grew faster than expected. More people came. More stories poured out. More needs surfaced. And yet, resources remained scarce. There were budget meetings filled with polite tension. Volunteers stretched thin. Unspoken expectations placed gently but firmly on her shoulders. You're really good at this, someone said one evening. We're so grateful God sent you. Daniela smiled, but later, alone, she whispered, I didn't ask to be strong. The spiritual resistance intensified, not dramatic, subtle. She began comparing herself to others in ministry, people with clearer callings, louder confidence, more visible impact. Scrolling became dangerous. Everyone else seemed certain. She felt exposed. You're behind, the thoughts whispered. You should have more by now. Real callings don't feel this fragile. Daniela recognized the voice. She had heard it before, during seasons of growth, right before breakthrough. Still, knowing didn't silence it. One night, after a particularly hard meeting, Daniela sat in her car long after the engine went cold. Her phone buzzed. A message from Naomi. Hey, I hope you're okay. I feel like I lost you a bit. Daniela stared at the screen. Tears came fast. This calling wasn't just costing comfort, it was costing closeness. She typed, deleted, typed again. I'm tired, she finally sent, and I don't know if I can keep doing this. Naomi replied almost instantly. You don't have to prove anything to God, you know. The words landed softly but sharply. Daniela rested her forehead against the steering wheel. I know, she whispered, but knowing and believing were not the same. That night, she didn't pray for strength. She prayed for permission. Lord, she said quietly, if you want me to stop, I will. Silence followed, not the comforting kind, the testing kind. The next day, Daniela drafted an email she never thought she'd write. I need to step back. Her finger hovered over send, and then knock. She looked up, startled. No one ever came by unannounced. At the door stood Leah. I'm sorry, she said breathlessly. I didn't know who else to come to. They sat together on the couch as Leah spoke about fear, relapse, confusion, the pull to return to old patterns. I remembered what you said, Leah whispered, about staying even when you don't feel qualified. Daniela closed her eyes. This wasn't coincidence. This was confrontation. After Leah left, Daniela sat alone, the unsent email still glowing on her laptop. She realized something then, something sobering and sacred. God had not called her because she was strong. He had called her because he could trust her to stay. Staying when it hurt, staying when it was quiet, staying when quitting would be easier. She deleted the email, not triumphantly, reverently. And for the first time in weeks, peace returned, not loud, not euphoric, but steady, like ground beneath her feet. That night, Daniela opened her Bible again. This time, her eyes didn't skim, they rested, and the words met her where she was. The breakthrough didn't come like Daniela imagined. There was no sudden clarity, no open doors swinging wide, no confirmation that wrapped everything in relief. Instead, there was exposure, the kind that leaves nothing hidden, not even from yourself. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Daniela arrived early at the church office, hoping for silence before the day unraveled. She set her bag down, reached for her notebook, and froze. A letter lay on her desk. No envelope, no name, just her handwriting. She recognized it immediately. It was a letter she had written months ago during a leadership retreat, an exercise they were told to complete for reflection only. Write down the reason you're afraid of this calling. She hadn't meant for anyone to ever see it again. Her heart pounded as she read. I'm afraid I'll give everything and still feel unseen. I'm afraid I'll disappoint God the way I've disappointed people. I'm afraid obedience will cost me the life I worked so hard to build. I'm afraid I'll disappear. Her throat tightened. She sat down slowly, the room suddenly too quiet. Calling, she realized, doesn't just ask for your availability, it asks for your honesty. That morning's session was heavy. A young man broke down mid-sentence. A woman confessed she was angry at God. Someone asked, how do you stay faithful when God doesn't explain himself? Daniela listened, and for the first time, she didn't reach for answers. She spoke from truth. I don't always stay strong, she said quietly, but I stay present. The room fell still. That was when she understood. God was not asking her to lead from certainty. He was asking her to lead from surrender. Later that day, she met with Pastor Michael. He listened as Daniela spoke about exhaustion, doubt, the fear of becoming invisible. When she finished, he nodded slowly. Do you know why God often calls people like you? He asked. She shook her head. Because you're willing to wrestle with him, he said, and wrestlers leave marked, but they don't leave empty. Daniela sat with that long after she left. That night, she cried again, but differently this time, not from fear, from release. She forgave herself for not being fearless, for not being certain, for needing rest. And in that forgiveness, something loosened. The weeks that followed were not easier, but they were clearer. Daniela learned to say no, to rest without guilt, to trust that productivity was not the measure of obedience. And slowly, quietly, fruit multiplied. Attendance grew. Lives softened. Trust deepened. But the greatest change wasn't visible. It was internal. She no longer needed to be seen. She was content being sent. One evening, Daniela stood alone again in the sanctuary. Same space, different heart. She whispered a prayer, not asking for direction this time, just gratitude. Thank you for not letting me quit, she said. And for the first time since the calling began, she smiled without tension. God's callings, she had learned, do not consume you, they consecrate you. They don't erase who you were, they redeem it. The invitation arrived without fanfare. No dramatic announcement, no title-heavy email, just a simple message from the senior leadership team. We'd like you to lead the new discipleship initiative. Prayerfully consider. Daniela stared at her screen for a long time. Months ago, this would have undone her, sent her spiraling into overthinking, fear, and self-doubt. Now she felt still, not confident in herself, but confident in God. She closed her laptop and whispered, "If this is you, you'll sustain me." Peace answered before clarity did. The initiative launched quietly. Small groups, story sharing, scripture, prayer, listening. No stage, no spotlight, and yet something extraordinary happened. People stayed. They opened up. They healed. They returned. The program grew faster than expected, not because it was impressive, but because it was honest. Daniela didn't preach perfection. She taught obedience in real life, and it resonated. One evening, after a particularly heavy session, a woman waited behind. She looked young, early 20s maybe, but her eyes carried weight. "I almost didn't come tonight," she admitted. Daniela smiled gently. "I'm glad you did." The woman hesitated, then said, "You talk about calling like it doesn't erase you, like God doesn't rush you." Daniela nodded. "Because he doesn't." The woman's voice broke. "I thought I was behind. Everyone I know is married, settled, successful. I feel like I've missed God." Daniela felt something stir. She had heard those words before, from her own mouth. "You haven't missed him," she said softly. "He's been with you in the waiting." Tears fell freely now. That was when Daniela understood something profound. Her calling was never meant to take her away from people. It was meant to bring her back to them, wounded, honest, available. Later that night, Daniela received a call she hadn't expected. Her mother. "I heard about the program," she said. "Someone from my prayer group attends. She said your words helped her forgive God." Daniela swallowed hard. Her mother continued, "I didn't always understand why you waited so long to settle into one thing, but now I see it." There was a pause. "I'm proud of you." It was a sentence Daniela didn't realize she'd been carrying hope for. That night, alone in her apartment, Daniela opened her old journals, pages filled with prayers she thought went unanswered, questions God never rushed to explain, tears she cried in secret. And there it was, threaded through every season, faithfulness. She hadn't been stuck, she had been sent ahead. Weeks later, the church asked her to share her testimony publicly. She hesitated, then agreed. Standing before the congregation, Daniela didn't speak about success. She spoke about surrender. "I thought calling would make me feel important," she said, "but it made me feel available." Silence filled the room. "I thought obedience would lead me faster, but it led me deeper." Some cried, some nodded. She finished simply, "If you're waiting, don't despise the room you're in. God often does his loudest work in quiet places." After service, Pastor Michael approached her. "You're walking in it now," he said. "In what?" asked Daniela. "In alignment," he replied. Daniela smiled. She finally understood. Calling is not about arrival. It's about agreement with God's timing, God's process, God's pace. And Daniela had said yes, not just once, but daily. That night, as she prayed before sleep, she didn't ask God what was next. She rested. For the first time, the future didn't feel urgent. It felt entrusted. And somewhere, quietly, unseen by Daniela, another young woman would soon hear God's whisper and wonder if she was ready. And Daniela would be there, not as someone who figured it all out, but as someone who stayed. The first sign came quietly. Daniela began to feel tired in a way rest didn't fix. Not the kind of exhaustion sleep solves, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles in the soul when responsibility grows heavier than anticipation. Her calendar filled quickly. More meetings, more counseling requests, more people who just needed 5 minutes. 5 minutes became hours. Hours became nights she fell into bed without praying, too tired to form words. She noticed it one evening when she sat at the edge of her bed, Bible unopened, heart strangely numb. "Lord, I don't feel you the way I used to." The silence frightened her. Growth has a cost no one talks about. When God expands your influence, he also expands your exposure. Criticism crept in quietly. "She's too soft. She's not deep enough. She talks about feelings more than doctrine." Daniela heard none of it directly, until she did. A leader pulled her aside gently. "Some people are questioning your approach," he said. "They think it's too vulnerable." Daniela nodded, but something inside her tightened. That night, doubt returned like an old acquaintance. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not equipped. Maybe I misunderstood God. Calling doesn't silence insecurity forever. It teaches you how to walk with it without obeying it. The real test came a month later. Daniela received an offer. A respected Christian organization wanted her to join their team. Better pay, clear structure, less emotional labor. It was everything she once prayed for. She sat at her kitchen table staring at the email, heart racing. This was safe. This was reasonable. This was easier. For the first time since saying yes to God's call, she wondered, was it okay to choose comfort now? She fasted, she prayed, she waited, and God answered not with excitement, but with truth. This will preserve you, but it will not stretch you. She wept because she knew. Calling doesn't always lead you away from good things. Sometimes it asks you to stay where it hurts because fruit is still forming. She declined the offer, and something broke open in her spirit. Not relief, resolution. Weeks later, a situation arose that tested everything she believed. A woman in the program, one Daniela had poured into, publicly accused her of manipulation. It spread quickly. Questions, tension, awkward silences. Daniela wanted to defend herself, to explain, to protect her name. Instead, God asked her to forgive, publicly. She stood before the group with trembling hands. "I'm sorry for any pain I caused," she said. "That was never my intention." Some people left, others stayed. Her reputation suffered, her obedience didn't. That night, Daniela collapsed on the floor of her living room. "I didn't sign up for this," she cried. "I said yes, but this feels unfair." God did not rebuke her. He reminded her, "You asked me to use you. This is how I shape servants." She stayed there a long time, and when she stood up, something in her had changed. She no longer needed affirmation. She had alignment. Months passed, the program stabilized, trust returned slowly, and something unexpected happened. People began to lead themselves. Daniela had worked herself out of the center, and that was the point. One evening, she watched from the back of the room as others facilitated prayer, scripture, healing conversations. She smiled. Calling was no longer about her presence. It was about multiplication. Later, Pastor Michael sat beside her. "You look lighter," he said. "I stopped trying to carry what was never mine." He nodded. "That's maturity." That night, Daniela wrote in her journal, "Calling is not proven by how loudly you are used. It is revealed by how quietly you obey." God's callings don't just change what you do. They dismantle who you thought you needed to be. They strip you of ego. They refine your motives. They anchor you in obedience when applause disappears. And if you stay, they give you something unshakable. Restoration did not arrive wrapped in apology. No one came back to publicly correct what had been said. No explanations were offered. No vindication speech was given. Instead, God restored Daniela internally first. She stopped rehearsing conversations in her head, stopped defending herself in silence, stopped measuring fruit by people's reactions. Peace returned, not as a feeling, but as posture. She stood differently now. One afternoon, Daniela received a message from someone she hadn't heard from in years, a former coworker, someone who had once dismissed her faith as too intense. The message read, "I don't know why I thought of you today, but I'm in a season where I need God and I don't know where to start." Daniela stared at the screen. There was a time she would have over-prepared, sent resources, links, long explanations. Now she replied simply, "Start where you are. God already knows how to meet you there." They met for coffee. then again, then prayer, then scripture. And without realizing it, Daniela was discipling again, not because she was positioned, but because she was available. Something else began to shift. Doors opened, but quietly. Invitations came, not flashy, but intentional. Smaller churches, women's gatherings, closed rooms where honesty mattered more than performance. She found herself speaking to people who didn't need to be impressed. They needed to be seen, and Daniela knew how to do that. One evening, she received a handwritten note after a session. The handwriting was uneven, rushed. It read, "I came here planning to end my life. I stayed because you said God doesn't waste hidden seasons." Daniela's hands trembled. She sat down hard, tears spilling. This was the reward. Not applause, not recognition, impact. Later that night, she knelt beside her bed. "I didn't know this was what you meant," she whispered. God answered, not audibly, but unmistakably. "I told you I would use you. I didn't tell you how quietly." Months later, the woman who had once accused her reached out. No drama, no long explanation, just a message. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. Thank you for showing grace I didn't deserve." Daniela stared at it for a long time. Then she typed back, "You're forgiven. I'm praying for you." And she meant it. That was the miracle. Daniela realized something then. God had restored her reputation not by repairing it, but by detaching her from it. She no longer needed people to get it right. She needed God to keep her soft. The final shift came when leadership approached her again, this time not with a role, but with trust. "We want to replicate what you've dealt," they said, "but we don't want you to lead it all." Daniela smiled. "Good," she said. "That means it worked." They laughed, not fully understanding, but she did. That night, Daniela walked home alone under streetlights that flickered softly. She remembered the early days, the fear, the doubt, the waiting, and she understood now. God hadn't delayed her calling, he had deepened it. Calling, she had learned, is not about becoming known, it's about becoming faithful. It's not about being visible, it's about being willing. And when God finally rewards obedience, he often does it in ways that don't inflate you, but anchor you. The moment came unexpectedly. Daniela was not on a stage. She wasn't leading a meeting. She wasn't even speaking. She was sitting in the back row, notebook closed, hands folded, simply listening. A young woman stood at the front of the room, nervous, steady, honest. She spoke about obedience, about fear, about staying when leaving would have been easier. Daniela recognized the language. It was familiar, not because she had taught it verbatim, but because she had lived it out loud. As the woman finished, the room sat in quiet reverence. Someone whispered, "She sounds like you." Daniela smiled faintly. "No," she thought, "she sounds like God." After the session, the woman approached her. "I hope I did okay," she said, almost apologetically. "You did more than okay. You were faithful." The woman hesitated. "You were the reason I stayed, when I wanted to quit, when I felt unqualified." Daniela's throat tightened. This was the part no one prepares you for, when your obedience becomes someone else's permission. Later that night, Daniela walked home slowly. She realized something sacred. Her calling had shifted. She was no longer at the center. She was becoming the covering. And that, somehow, felt fuller. Legacy doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It shows up in people who don't need you anymore, but carry what you poured. Daniela had once feared becoming invisible. Now she understood. God had never planned to erase her. He planned to multiply her obedience through others. Weeks later, she was asked to step into a season of rest, not forced, invited. "You've built well," leadership said. "Now let it breathe." Years ago, that would have terrified her. Now it felt right. She stepped back without guilt, and the work continued. In the quiet, Daniela returned to the basics: morning prayers without urgency, scripture without assignment, faith without outcome-driven expectations. She remembered why she loved God before He ever gave her responsibility, and her joy returned, simple, deep, rooted. One afternoon, she received a letter, no return address. Inside was a note written in careful handwriting. "I will never know your name, but your obedience saved my life. I chose to stay because you stayed." Daniela's hands trembled. She sat down hard, tears spilling. This was the inheritance. That night, she wrote one final journal entry about calling. God doesn't call us to be remembered. He calls us to be faithful, and faithfulness echoes longer than fame ever could. She closed the journal, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was still becoming. She felt established, not in position, but in purpose. Daniela returned to the small sanctuary one evening when no one else was there. The lights were dim, the chairs neatly arranged, the air still. It was the same room where she had once sat alone, wondering if she had imagined God's voice. She walked slowly to the front and sat down, not to lead, not to pray for anyone else, just to remember. She remembered the fear, the nights she cried herself to sleep asking God if she was behind, the seasons where obedience felt invisible, the moments she nearly walked away because the cost felt too high. She remembered how calling first sounded like pressure and how God patiently turned it into peace. Daniela bowed her head. "Thank you," she whispered, not for success, not for recognition, but for keeping her soft. She realized something then, something that settled deep in her spirit. God had never been preparing her for a platform. He had been preparing her for people. Calling, she finally understood, is not a destination. It is a posture. It is waking up every day and saying, "Here I am, Lord," even if no one sees it. It is choosing obedience when the reward is unclear, forgiveness when the wound is public, faithfulness when quitting would be easier. And God had met her in every yes. As she sat there, Daniela imagined all the people who had passed through her life. The woman who stayed, the one who forgave, the one who learned to lead, the one who would never sign her name but would live because she did. Legacy wasn't loud, it was layered. She stood and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back once more, and for the first time, she smiled without asking God what was next, because she finally knew.